As far as the summary goes, chapter 16 is really simple. The ark has now arrived in Jerusalem, and David is going to install it in this tent that is prepared for it. And David is going to assign the Levites their roles in the liturgy. David is then going to break into a psalm that's really a composite psalm of roughly three different psalms. And that's most of the chapter in a nutshell. However, when we look closer, there's still quite a bit to talk about. There's some interesting stuff, some typological stuff, some gematria stuff. So we'll just go ahead and jump in to the text itself. So starting at verse 1. And they brought in the ark of God and set it inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And they offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before God. And when David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord, and he distributed to all of Israel, both men and women, to each a loaf of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins. Then he appointed some of the Levites as ministers before the ark of the Lord to invoke, to thank, and to praise the Lord, the God of Israel. And then it's going to break off into one of these roll calls, and I'm going to jump off right there. But this is actually an interesting thing to talk about here in the very beginning. This is the New King James, and as far as I could tell, roughly all of the texts more or less do this, where they break the paragraph off right here. However, in the manuscripts itself, which the paragraph breaks weren't inspired per se, but it is interesting usually to look at because they tended to do. I think we should more often go with what they did. I don't know why we don't stick with that, because there are times it never really affects theology per se, but there's some interesting stuff that happens. So if we take this as a section, the way the ancients sectioned this off with the kind of like the way, my point being here that the typesetting is a little misleading. I think if we take this as the unit, as the section, Labashim points out that this is actually 52 words total, which is 26 times 2, which 26 being one of the values of the divine name Yahweh. And this reminds me also of another similar kind of thing, probably one of the more famous examples of this kind of thing, where the modern translations, sometimes they break either verses or chapters, and sometimes just things like the paragraph breaks. They put them in kind of odd places that are, it's just kind of unfortunate where they put them sometimes. So Genesis 2, specifically verse 3, if you've ever studied out the two so-called creation accounts, this is kind of interesting because we break it off. Chapter 2, obviously, it starts right here at chapter 2. But you'll almost always come across this in commentaries, that they will point out that really chapter 2 should probably begin at verse 4. And there are a number of reasons why that's the case. I'm not going to get into all those reasons, but one of those reasons I will point out here, and that you'll never come across in the commentary. Chapter 1 has 31 verses. The first 3 verses, again, most commentators are going to say belong to chapter 1, actually. But you put those together, 31 plus 3, that's 34, which is 17 times 2. 17 being the other value of the divine name. You get that divine value invoked in there, which I think is probably the case. I think that that's legitimate, and it's just another reason. Again, there are many other reasons why we should probably start chapter 2 at verse 4, but that's a different discussion, but it's kind of similar because it pops up here. But we'll go ahead and take this from the top. So Selman notes in his commentary here that the primary objective of chapters 13 through 15 is fulfilled by the ark's arrival in Jerusalem. So point is, we've been on this mission to get the ark into Jerusalem, and we finally hit that punctuating point. Of course, the ark being the symbol of God's presence. And he's going to point out here that this chapter is arranged chiastically, again, kind of in this mirroring pattern here. So the first 3 verses, God's blessing for every Israelite, and that's mirrored by the last verse where David blesses his household. So we have here in B, the Levites appointed for worship at Jerusalem, and B prime, we have the Levites and the priests appointed for worship at Gibeon. And that puts at the center the Psalm of Praise. So like I said, it's this like composite psalm, and that's the focus mostly of this chapter. commenting on this language here of David blessing the people in the name of the Lord, Johnstone is going to point out that this is without parallel in the Hebrew Bible, and that there's even question about what exactly he apportioned out to them. Here it's translated as a loaf of bread, portion of meat, and that kind of thing. But the more important part here is that it may be understood as an act of royal hospitality and table fellowship, confirming the bond between king and the people and the solidarity of their action. I think more importantly, though, it's also striking that this is the same root of the verb to distribute, is to be highly typical of Chronicles' presentation of David's reign. David is the one who apportions, it's the same term, not only supplies to his people as here, but also rosters of duties to the priests and Levites. There is a certain similarity between the role filled by David here as cult founder and that of Moses. And of course, they mean cult, like in the not in like the negative sense, just the worship is what they're referring to. David too was ad hoc officiant at the altar, necessarily so at the institution of the Aaronic priesthood in Leviticus 8. Summoner, again, kahal, that's our term we've come across a lot here in Chronicles. Summoner of the people, pitcher of the tent for the ark, and blesser of the people. As David has already been presented as a new Joshua, that's 1 Chronicles 12:15, so in fact, more typically here, he is portrayed as the new Moses, uniquely favored with intimacy with God above and beyond the forms and institutions of worship that he is to bequeath to be observed after him. So point is, in the way he's acting here, again, here distributing to people kind of in a priestly function. In fact, Myers is going to point this out as well, that there's like this priestly element to it. Again, very much mirroring Moses, who kind of preceded the Aaronic priesthood. So he kind of had to do the initial setting of that stage. So Myers says, the parceling out of food may be connected with the peace offering in which the worshipers always shared, and that's in Leviticus 7, specifically verse 11, which marked the reconciliation of the worshiper with God. Verse 2 follows 2 Samuel, that's, 6:18, almost exactly. David performed the priestly rites himself, an act specifically toned down in the preceding verse. But the point is, his function, he's doing the priestly functions here. And here I have the note that Levishing pointed out, that this section here is 52 total words. Moving further down, Johnstone is commenting on this language here of the Levites being appointed as ministers before the ark. Johnstone says, with their prayers and praises set to music, they are to be in perpetual attendance before the ark. This association of Asaph with the ark is to be of significance in the later narrative in connection with the victories on the battlefield still to be won. And that's later in 2 Chronicles, obviously. That's a long way off. Commenting on this language here, to invoke, to thank, to praise the Lord. Of significance here is this phrase to invoke, because to thank and to praise is pretty obvious, right? Like, it's kind of self-explanatory. Japhet comments on to invoke here that this is a priestly role according to Numbers 10:10. You shall blow the trumpets; they shall serve you for remembrance. It's the same term, before your God. Johnstone here has a longer note, again commenting on this same language. He says, let's move down a little bit here. The nature of the first task of the Levites is less clear. Again, this to invoke language. The verb is used with the noun name in the sense of to invoke, like to invoke the name. Exodus 20, you get this 2024. It says, in every place I cause my name to be remembered. I will come to you and bless you, is the language. Though he points out here that name is not actually mentioned here specifically, although it is, name does immediately come up once we jump into this, the Psalms. Or the psalm that David is going to do. Name actually occurs with some frequency there, as well as David blessing the people in the name of the Lord. So it's not specifically there, but throughout the broader context, it actually is. It can also, however, mean when used by itself, as here, to recall, especially to bring to light past offenses. Hence, virtually to confess. Given that there are so many psalms of lament in the Psalter, one might expect reference to be made to them here alongside the thanksgiving and the hymn. That this may be the case here is suggested by the fact that, this term here appears in the title of two Psalms, 38 and 70, both of which are laments, and the first of which is a penitential psalm. The source of the material in verses 34 through 36 and the implication of verse 35 clearly suggest such an element. The point is getting at here, especially if we move down to verse 35, you get this language about save us, O God, of our salvation, and gather us and deliver us from the nations. It's very exilic, right? Like they've been exiled, they've been scattered among the nations, and so it's kind of that foreshadowing of that. And of course, that dovetails nicely uh, with this lament, with this remembrance of um, language. So that's part of what's going on. That's part of what's lurking beneath that language of to invoke before the ark, what the Levites are tasked to do. And moving down to verse 5, Asaph was to sound the cymbals, and Benaniah and Jehaziel, the priests, were to blow trumpets regularly before the ark of the covenant of God. This language of first appointed, Japhet is going to note here that this is that frankly first is a poor translation because it doesn't ever mean that. It's she says here this usage is not attested in the Bible. It is the usual at the head of, referring to Asaph and his brethren who were to conduct the Thanksgivings on that day. If I actually click out on it, you'll find that it should highlight for us the here chief. Asaph was the chief. That's literally what it means. In fact, it's Genesis 1:1. It's the first word roughly in the Bible, right? So you have I have to click on it again, but here in the beginning, right? So what it literally means is at the head of, or something to that effect, chiefly or whatever. But continuing on, but it is worth thinking about because Lightheart brought it up a couple times previously. You actually have that language because it brings to mind the Genesis 1:1 kind of stuff. Like there's something new happening. But continuing on, now we're going to get into David's Psalms. And here we have a couple of comments here from the commentators, and they're going to more or less give us the outline of most of this. We're not going to read through most of it because it's a bit lengthy. But Lightheart says in his commentary, in this psalm, is referring here to David's, this long composite psalm that is the bulk of this chapter, there are 12 liturgical commandments for the 12 tribes and 10 for the nations, a total of 22 commands, matching the number of letters in the Hebrew alphabet. The psalm is an aleph to tav of praise. What it's referring to here is you have like give thanks, sing to the Lord, glory, seek, remember, and if you count up all these these commandments, so to speak, they are you get 22 total. You get 12 that are to the tribes, and then he's going to start referring to all the people later, so all the nations. And there's 10 of those commandments. So you put those together, you get 22. That's his point. Moving down to Johnstone, in page 192, he says, Psalm 105 is a great song of national thanksgiving for the mighty acts of God in bringing his people into being through the deliverance from Egypt and their safe conduct through the wilderness. The psalm ends with the significant comments on the reason for this deliverance and safekeeping. The reason for the Exodus, the reason they were delivered, is that they, that is Israel, might keep his statutes and observe his laws. Psalm 96 is a pure hymn celebrating the universal dominion of the Lord as creator. Psalm 106 is, by contrast, a long confession of historic national sin, and that's more or less the composite psalm that he makes up is 105, 96, and 106. But I thought he was going to bring it up here. He might bring it up later down. But again, part of the reason they're delivered out of Egypt is to keep the statutes, observe the laws, so on and so forth. But it's so that they can establish a place for God's name to dwell, his presence, which is symbolized by the Ark of the Covenant itself. You get this in 2 Samuel 6. So it says that they call the Ark, so they bring up the Ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord of hosts who sits enthroned on the cherubim. And you have actually the doubling up of the name, Shem. So the point here is that they actually called the Ark of the Covenant the name. And the name is, to use the fancy word, it's a circumlocution, which is, again, a fancy way of saying another way of saying something. So the president is the commander-in-chief, or the leader of the free world or whatever, right? These are all titles of the same thing. Post Babel, really, but post Garden of Eden up to Babel, God is now looking for a people so that he can establish a place to dwell with the people again, as he did in Eden. And that is going to be a temple. This is why the temple has similar, the way it's designed, the way its layout, its structure is similar to original creation, the Garden of Eden, all that stuff. You have these tripartite divisions. You have just the way it's spoken about, the decorations. It's supposed to bring back to mind the Garden of Eden. And that's where God was going to dwell with them. It's where he's intending to dwell again. So it was imperative that he has a people that can set up a temple, that can set up a place for his presence to dwell with the people directly, right? And so this is the whole purpose of all of this stuff. And so when you're invoking the Exodus in these Psalms and in some of the types, you have to keep that in mind that this is where it's all headed. It's headed to ultimately build the temple so that God can dwell with the people again. And again, the Ark of the Covenant being moved into the tent, all of that it's getting to that point. It's getting closer and closer to that point. Of course, all of that is a shadow of the New Testament reality of God dwelling, Emmanuel, God dwelling directly with the people in the incarnation, right? Dwelling bodily with the people. But anyway, continuing further down, by combining material from these three Psalms, each of a different category, Chronicles is exploiting the resources of Israel's liturgical heritage in the fullest possible way within the limited space of these verses. His selection is a distillation of the material most relevant to his theme of Israel's vocation to realize God's purposes among the nations of the world, their abject and repeated failure to do so, and their continuing dependence on new acts of God's pardon and restoration. And Hahn is going to make similar observations about which sections match with which sections. You can pause that and take a screenshot or something if you want to look specifically at what matches with what. And he's saying that this is biblical theology in its own right. In this priestly song of redemption, David interprets Israel's history as an economy of salvation flowing from the covenant with Abraham to this moment when the ark has been restored. And it's kind of what I was getting at above. It is a common practice among translators to correct the chronicler's quotations so that they agree with the Psalms he is drawing from. This is a dubious practice because, as Williamson declares, these Psalms were no doubt familiar to the chronicler's audience from their regular worship. Therefore, even the few changes that the chronicler has made would have been significant and noticed. As Selman says, these small variations make it almost certain that earlier scripture has been reinterpreted and applied to the circumstances of the chronicler's time. I'm not sure if I brought it up and if I bring it up in these notes here, but at least one of the commentators actually made this point that in many ways what the New Testament does, the way it interprets scripture, in many ways is began here in Chronicles, that they're doing this self-referential thing that the New Testament does. So it's just really interesting because Chronicles just gets overlooked almost all the time, but it's doing a lot of like New Testament type thinking. It's just kind of interesting. Moving further down to verse 9, sing praises to him, tell of all his wondrous works, glory in his holy name. Let the hearts of those who seek the Lord rejoice. Commenting on this, John Stone is going to point out here in the word holy, the basic theme of the whole of Chronicles' work is thus touched on already at the beginning of the psalm. The objective physical expression of this devotion to God and commitment to his will is also noted. Seek the Lord and his strength, with the key term seek, signifying the exclusive resorting to God. And again, we've been over this term quite a bit. We've come across it. Under the figure of his strength, the ark as the focus and symbol of the divine presence is meant. The JPSV notes this point with reference to strength as the title of the ark in Psalms 78:61 and 132, verse 8. The psalm thus relates directly to the immediately preceding narrative of the bringing of the ark to Jerusalem. Right, so just more of that theme of God's strength and his name and that kind of thing. You also have the glory as well, although this is actually a different term for glory. Here, further down, you do get the same kind of juxtaposition is the wrong term because it's not being opposed, but you have further down you have the name again, and you have glory again, glory, strength, glory to his name. And we've brought this up in one of the gematria videos, that glory is kavod. Kavod, at least one of the spellings of kavod, is also again 17 or 26, which is the same for the value of the divine name. So you very often have this where you have stuff like this: ascribe to the Lord the glory due to his name. If you're thinking in the symbolic numerical terms, it's 17 and 26. They're used almost interchangeably. And again, that's it's something that pops up in this psalm. So moving down here to seek his presence continually in verse 11, Johnstone notes that this reference here, the ark as container of the tablets of the Decalogue, testifies to the covenant relationship between God and Israel, which is interesting because, again, remember the ark. I'm sorry, rather the tablets, the Ten Commandments, were put into the ark. So when you have references to the ark and these kind of things, you also kind of need to keep that in mind, because that is part of some of the theological, I don't want to say baggage, but it's part of the framework, the cognitive framework, if you want to use that phrase, of what you think of when you think of the ark. You're also thinking of the covenant with with Moses and the Ten Commandments and stuff like that. Verse 16, the covenant that he made with Abraham, his sworn promise to Isaac. And commenting on this, because in some of there was a reference where, again, it's in one of the source psalms, a reference, I think, to Abraham specifically, a direct reference was kind of like taken out. So here he's saying in verse 16, Chronicles now retains the reference to Abraham, and is saying, compare this to the location of the temple to be on Abraham's Mount Moriah in 2 Chronicles 3:1. It is a psalm recalling the covenant with the founding patriarch of the people, rather than the formal covenant with the people itself as a whole at Sinai, that Chronicles finds its most apposite to cite. So point is, now everybody's being looped in, right? So we had Moses earlier, and now we have Abraham being invoked here in this, as well as Isaac in this covenant. Of course, it's going to bring up Jacob, right, following after. So again, it's really a sweep in many ways of it's almost like the Old Testament version of Stephen's speech in Acts. Continuing down, I'm not going to read all of the notes, although I have been posting like all the text from the notes on Facebook, so I'll put a link somewhere, either in the description or on my profile. You can find a link. And commenting on the fact that from here on out, right, so verse 23, we're going to skip down to that part. Labashine points out that part 2 of the psalm and Israel's response is 130 words, which is 5 times 26. And Johnstone commenting, he says the third section of Chronicles composite psalm, verses 23 through 33, corresponds to the first verses 8 through 13. They are linked thematically by the words wonderful works and strength and judge. Like the first, so the second is a summons to praise God, only this time those summoned are not Israel, but the whole world, its inhabitants, the nations and peoples, and creation as a whole, heavens, earth, sea, and land, and the trees of the forest. This universal summons corresponds to Chronicles' purpose. His work begins with Adam, the father of humankind, created for immediacy of fellowship with God. All Adam's children are now summoned to acknowledge God's purpose, portrayed in Israel's history, his sole deity and transcendent power declared in creation, and to ascribe to the Lord the glory due to his name in verse 29. Thus, the cosmic dimensions of the tradition of Jerusalemite royal theology, as in verse 26b, are affirmed not only by kings Solomon and Jehoshaphat, but acknowledged by foreign kings, Hiram and Cyrus, at the end of Chronicles. So the point is, this is looping all the peoples in, the entire creation, just as Chronicles did at the beginning with Adam. Again, we're getting everybody brought in this portion of the psalm. moving further down, verse 29, add my next note here. Worship the Lord in splendor of holiness, or holy attire, it says in the footnote. So, commenting on this, Johnstone says that the nations are called accordingly to make confession of their submission, to acknowledge with dread God's sovereignty, and clad in fitting garb, that is holy attire. Again, he notes that the root here is the same as we had above, the QDS root. To bring their tribute, minha now to become the technical term for the recognition of God and of David as his vice regent. Now, this is, I think, is important. It's worth pausing on here for a second. And I was talking to a friend of mine personally, and she was telling me she's like on the fringes of converting to Christianity. She's kind of like halfway there, but she was saying that it really does seem in Matthew. She was quoted a passage out of Matthew that Jesus was only there for Israel, that the Gentiles were never supposed to be part of this. And I pointed out to her just simply, even in the same book, that at the end of Matthew, you have Jesus sending the disciples out to all the nations, because she was saying that the explanations didn't really satisfy her enough. And but I was pointing out to her, look, unless you're going to do this, the critical thing where you're going to divide all the stuff into different sources, and this source goes with that source, and this, which there's no way to know that. But unless you're going to do that kind of thing where you just implode the Bible into a million pieces and not look at it as a coherent whole, you have to be able to say, well, in the same book where Jesus is only going to the lost sheep of Israel, that kind of thing, he is then sending everybody out to all the nations. And similarly, you have these themes in the Old Testament itself. You have the Gentile nations, the non-Israelites, worshiping God in splendor of holiness, in holy attire. You have them wearing priestly attire in places. You have this kind of stuff in Isaiah as well. It was always part of the plan. I mean, I understand it, but I feel like it's massively overstated. This idea how somehow the Gentile inclusion, like Paul, like the Pauline letters, stuff like that, where people will take it as this is different. Paul is now including the Gentiles in ways that Jesus never intended or whatever. It's just like, but it's in the Old Testament. I mean, it just, to me, it's a massive overstating of the case. But like I said, it's worth pausing and thinking about here, because you have it here. You have it in the Old Testament. So anyway, we'll continue further. I'm not sure how much more of this we're going to comment on. This phrase here, then shall the trees of the forest sing for joy before the Lord, for he comes to judge the earth. Han notes here that David's priestly song builds to an exhortation to worship the living God, followed by a denouncement that declares the Lord's coming to judge the earth. In the context of the chronicler's narrative, the Lord's coming to Zion in the ark is readily associated with the Lord's coming in judgment of the nations and the idols of the peoples. Let them say among the nations, the Lord reigns. And I would couple this, again, in its ultimate fulfillment in the New Testament and the expulsion of the demonic powers over the nations. Again, this is Heiser stuff, Deuteronomy 32, Daniel 10, all of that kind of stuff. The foreign powers, and by that I mean the cosmic powers, are being driven out among the nations as Gentiles are being brought in to knowledge of God and to his reign and so on and so forth. And verse 35, here we get to save us, O God of our salvation. And again, in this save us language, you have kind of the Hosea language, as well as salvation, of course, being kind of the root of Jesus' name, of Joshua, that kind of thing. So save us, O God of our salvation, and gather and deliver us from among the nations, that we may give thanks to your holy name and glory to your praise. And again, we have glory and name brought up in conjunction with each other. Johnstone says, immediately a note of somber realism is struck. The picture of the previous section of nature rejoicing in unison with the universal acknowledgement of the sovereignty of God is an ideal that awaits its consummation in the future. Israel, indeed, is still in exile. The mood of the psalm, therefore, changes to petition. Deliver us, O God of our salvation. Both deliver and salvation being words derived from the same root, which has already been used in verse 23, as well as 1 Chronicles 11:14. Remember, this is when David and one of the other men, I forget which one, they defend that barley field. You can go back, obviously, and read it, and we commented on some of that language there in the video on chapter 11. Chronicles intensifies the appeal of the psalm by adding salvation, and in the next phrase, to rescue us. And again, you can cross-reference that with the story there in chapter 11. But yeah, and I did want to note before I moved on that that this idea of exile and the fact that they're in exile, even after they return from exile from the nations, when Cyrus sends the decree, they go back, all that kind of stuff. They still said they were in exile into the New Testament era. And they still felt that. They still felt that exile was ongoing. And if you're going to deny basically the Christian message, that is, if you retain Judaism or something, they're still in exile. They've never returned, and I would say they never can come back out of exile because of the fact that they lost everything at 70 AD, as far as they lost the temple. So that therefore you have no real priests anymore. They lost the genealogical information largely when that stuff was destroyed in 70 AD in the temple. It's over. The old system was completely over at 70 AD, which would be exactly 40 years after Jesus was crucified, very likely. He was crucified on 30 AD. Commenting further down, Han says, in one sense, this is a continuation of the Moses typology. For David here is prophesying the future punishment of the people, and this is what I was getting at before, for the failure to keep the covenant. The chronicler is also reinforcing his theme that God is in charge of history. The Lord who enthroned David also knew that the kingdom would be laid low, yet he could count on his readers knowing the fuller context of Psalm 106, which he is quoting here. Many times he delivered them. He remembered for their sake his covenant. And that's Psalm 106:43 and verse 45. Further down, that we may give thanks to your holy name. Lightheart is going to comment on this, that here we are back to Israel, Judah again. Remember, there was that discourse on the nations. The people who above all can declare Yahweh's hesed, his covenant loyalty and family love. It is the 28th exhortation to praise. Praise is multiplied through 7 days and to the four corners. Sabbatical praise stretches to the ends of the earth, turning the entire world into a four-horned altar. In Revelation, you actually get some of the sevens. You get this 7 times 4 kind of thing happen, which is really interesting. On this section here, the worship before the altar, John Stone is noting here that these verses, which concern the tent of meeting and the altar of burnt offerings at Gibeon, do not strictly belong to the narrative of events concerning the Ark of Jerusalem, but are added nonetheless because these two institutions, the tent and the ark, remain in the meantime the foci of Israel's worship until David constructs the altar in Jerusalem in chapter 22, and Solomon has completed the building of the temple in 2 Chronicles. The tabernacle of the Lord is the tabernacle associated with the period of wandering in the wilderness, which now ends up at Gibeon. Notably, when Chronicles specifies the priest who functions at Gibeon, he mentions only Zadok, omitting Abiathar, whose line is destined to be supplanted in the intrigues surrounding Solomon's ascension in 1 Kings. The duties of the Zadokite priesthood are therefore defined as the offering of the continual burnt offerings in punctilious observance of the revealed law of God. And for the sake of time, I will not comment on the Abiathar thing, which I kind of want to, because Jesus brings him up in the New Testament in, I think, an interesting way, but that's not the subject for today. And we'll close out chapter 16 here. Then all the people departed, each to his house, and David went home to bless his household. Commenting on this, John Stone is going to point out that this term here, house, with which the chapter ends, forms the link to the next chapter. David, having glorified his own house, desires to build a fitting house for God. God's reply, through the prophetic word of Nathan, is that it is God who will build for David a house, not David for God. Chronicles makes this transition from house to dynasty the clearer by omitting the distracting material on David's wife, Michal, daughter of Saul, useful foil though it might have provided. So, in other words, that section, the conversation between the two, is omitted, and so it just jumps right into to chapter 17, where we get this household. Let's just click on it again. As you can see, the house is going to start populating in chapter 17, where the house of David and the house of God is going to be discussed. And of course, that again has New Testament messianic Jesus type connections, but we will hold all that off for next time in chapter 17.